Well, hey, I am excited today. We're going to be continuing our series in James, How Faith Works. I'm excited today because I get the opportunity to speak with my good friend, Justin. Come on, let's give it up for Justin as he's here this morning. Justin, you've been a part of New Life about maybe a year and a half with Central Kids Hub. Now you're here in Bremerton. Catch us up, kind of what are you up to and what is Jesus doing next?
So I'd start with, I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee. Any Memphis lovers out there?
Oh, just a couple.
We're not down with the blues, barbecue, and basketball? Come on, folks. No, I'm just teasing. So I've been here in Kitsap about a year, and about a year and a half, and really came after a long season of living in Spokane. My family, we planted a church there, got to serve that church for about 13 years. Also a web developer, done some training for Apple, so kind of had my hands in a lot of different things. But it was time for something that was next. I wasn't even sure. But we landed in Kitsap through some relationships, landed with in the New Life family, and over the last year, probably been helping with a variety of kind of tech-related and other special projects. But my wife and I had a chance to visit here due to some work she was doing several months back. And just honestly, I even told you, I think I texted you that same day. What's going on here, who we are and are becoming. And I'm saying we because I'm in, right?
Come on.
It is beautiful. It was just something that drew me in. So about a month and a half, 2 months ago almost, just kind of began jumping in here with my family and love being a part of it. So thanks for your great welcome and including us in it.
So cool. Glad that we're able to share together. And you know, Justin's been a big help to the campus, really providing some needed leadership, has a skill set that can really move the mission forward here in Bremerton. So we're excited to have you a part of this team, Hannah as well, and your wonderful family. So let's jump right in. We're in this series, How Faith Works, putting your faith in motion. And one of the things I love about this series, as we've been diving in the book of James, we've been able to align, we've been saying it every week, align what it is that we believe with how we live that out. And so James does a great job showing us, based on what you believe about Jesus, based on what you believe about God, based on what you believe about the world, here is what that looks like practically on the ground. And it's interesting because James is reminding this church of the mission that they had signed up for. This early church had launched, people were being transformed, the gospel was being preached, and then for whatever reason, the mission began to drift. And James calls it pride or arrogance and other things that can get in the way of us moving the mission forward. And he writes this letter to remind them kind of that center compass, that true north that says this is how you live out your faith. And I don't know if you've ever been in a season or a situation in your life where you've asked the question, is my faith working? Why do I believe what I believe? And oh, by the way, what does that practically look like in my life? Can I point to these checkpoints in my life where I can say, that was my faith at work? And James helps us see it's really not this magical formula that just pops out of the sky that says this is faith. He reminds us kind of the two greatest commandments that Jesus gave, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And as you start there as a foundation, you begin to see the works come out of that put your faith in motion. And so he says, how can you say you have faith in God and yet you show favoritism? How can you say you have faith in God, but yet you're acting arrogant? We talked about it last week, this Jesus way. Every week we've been looking at how would Jesus do it? How would Jesus help us put our faith in motion? And last week we looked at the Jesus way of humility is what stops the fighting. Humility. This church was fighting, and there's a powerful word, Justin, that me and my wife were talking about all week, this word quarrel. And again, I shared last week, nobody says, hey, man, you want to quarrel? But there's this something special about quarrel because it's a trivial disagreement or a fight between two people that are supposed to be on good terms. As I think about those, my wife is probably at the top of the list. As somebody I'm my soulmate, but yet her and I are in disagreements. And so this past week, we had some things that we didn't see eye to eye on, and we saw it going down the wrong path. We would stop and say, hey, you know what? That's a quarrel. We're not going to spend any time there. Maybe your next step as you think about conflict resolution in your life, to say, especially with those that are close to you know what? That was a quarrel, and we're not going to spend any time with that because that's going to detract us from who we are called to be as a family, as a friend, as a church. And today, James is going to take a step further, and we're going to look at this term called generosity. And I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of generosity or what it means to be generous, but James has something to say about it. Matter of fact, you can write this down. Today, James is going to remind us of the Jesus way, which is the Jesus way of generosity is trust. The Jesus way of generosity is trust. And Justin, James has some really good things to say about that.
Yeah, what's going on actually today in the text we're going to look at, James is kind of inviting us to consider what posture are we living into our lives from. And you could really sum it up in these two words. Yeah. Is it a posture, a way of looking at things through a providential lens, or a way of being presumptive? And here's what I mean by that. The way of providence is where I recognize that all that's been given to me, the experiences, the goodness, all of the good and helpful things in my life, I didn't do those on my own. They are the product of a generous creator who is sustaining me, sustaining the world, and actually gracing me into these moments of life. Yeah. There's this other way, though, and the text we're going to look at really kind of unpacks this. There's this other way we may be tempted to live in that's more presumptive, like I got here on my own, I'm self-made, I did this through my determination and grit. And there's nothing wrong with determination or grit, but there is a perspective. Who am I? Is it through God's grace and goodness, or is it through just I'm self-made? And I think that has a real bearing of then what we end up doing with our lives. Yes, good. So I was thinking about that, this way of presumption, or maybe another word we would use is assuming. So I grew up in a place where I was taught this little riddle as a kid, like what assuming does. We can talk about it later if you want to. But I also realized there's parts of my life where I've been given to that. So for instance, a couple weeks ago, I assumed that I had done a masterful job of hiding the Halloween candy. But the next day when I went to get my Twix, I realized that the people living in my house must have great skill because they found it, consumed it, and it was gone. Not even a wrapper. I don't know what they did with that.
Got rid of the evidence.
Yeah, no doubt. The other thing I was thinking about is this. I have this habit, unfortunately, of assuming that Google Maps, while it says it's going to take me half an hour to get there, it just doesn't know me. Because it's only going to take me 20 minutes to get there. Yeah. Anybody with me on that? All right.
We just do our own thing.
Yeah, like it does not know my superpowers. Another kind of story that came to mind in this kind of presumptive, assuming way, it was a moment in my life where I knew that victory was mine. So my wife, Hannah, and I had been married just a few months, living in this small little apartment and, pretty much broke. So what we did for fun was play games, hung out, stuff like that. So we're playing Trivial Pursuit one night. And we were all deadlocked. The pies were full. It was like whoever got the next question won the game. And it was up to me to choose the category for her, and I know her. And so in my cunning and skill, I knew exactly what to do. She is brilliant. She is a go-getter. She is creative, but she's not a huge sports enthusiast. So I chose the sports category. And I was like, I have her. I mean, I already was planning my victory march. And then this thing happened. I drew the card, and I was like, I'm still okay, but And the question went like this. Hey, what's the name of the Utah Jazz swingman whose nickname is the Mailman? And she goes, oh, it's Karl Malone. Probably in that same term. And I was like, are you kidding me? I mean, she doesn't know sports, and I know that's a low bar question, but she answered it with just like great joy to my demise. Yeah. And I didn't know what to do with myself. That assumption led me down a dark path because when I did not get what I wanted, I stood up immediately. I ripped the game board in half. I ran into our bedroom only to realize the little cheap apartment we were living in, the window did not open to let me out of the house. And so I had to stay there in my shame until I could come back and say, I'm sorry. Assuming led me down a dark path. Yeah, for sure. And I found that in life that can be the case sometimes. And I actually think even when it comes to generosity, there may be times we let assumptions kind of take the lead. I was thinking about that. I was reading a report recently put out by the Gallup Group, and it was looking at the world's most generous countries. And one of the assumptions that it brought to mind, one I've encountered, I don't know if you've ever encountered this before, is that, man, when I look at all the world's needs and challenges and struggles, there must be this huge void of generous people. Yeah. People must not be being generous. That sometimes is an assumption, I think, that gets played out. Yeah. But I'm reading this report, and listen to what it said. In 2017, 1.4 billion people donated money, 1 billion people donated time, and this is the one that actually captured me, this last one. 2.2 billion people helped a stranger in need in the prior month. Wow. Now, we can look at how many people live on the planet and say there's still work to be done. I think we're all in on that.
Yeah.
But 2.2 billion people actually going out of their way to help someone in need that they may not even know, I think there's a lot of generosity in motion in the world. Would you agree with me?
Yeah, come on.
Work to do, but man, there is generosity all around us. And I started thinking about us.
Yeah.
I mean, just a few weeks ago, we got together and gave of our time and our resources and being present with others, and we threw a party for our neighborhood because we love our city.
Yeah, come on.
I think of, again, this young man who's joining together with people, right, to bless the world. There is generosity around us. Let's not let the assumption take over and kind of make us cynical. Let's do our part, but let's see it. Another assumption that I encountered as I was looking at this report, it kind of brought to mind is one that I've dealt with from time to time. I don't know if you have, and it goes like this. I don't know if I have enough to be generous. You ever encountered that one?
Yeah.
I don't know if I actually have enough.
Yeah.
I mentioned the story where I was not on my best behavior in that cheap little apartment. And I remember there were things we did that were generous, but I also would just be honest and say, I've sometimes wondered, could I take care of me and mine and still open my hands to others? Yeah. And I'm reading this report, though, and it just showed me maybe there's something bigger than those assumptions. Maybe there is a more providential thing going on. Because listen to this. The people most likely to donate money, according to that Gallup report, came from the countries of Myanmar and Indonesia. And here's why I mention those. First, they were the top two.
Okay.
But second, Myanmar has an annual average income of $1,140.
Wow.
Well, I make more than $1,140 a year.
Yeah.
And it just struck me, not with shame or guilt, but like, oh, maybe I have more than I thought. Maybe I have more resources than I think I do. Yeah. And the same with Indonesia. And it began to kind of move me off of that assumption that sometimes we pick up through our families or society or other places. Maybe there's another way. Maybe there's something else going on. Another one that it brought to light that kind of dispels that is the people most likely to volunteer their time are from Indonesia, Liberia, Kenya, and Sri Lanka. And then this one, the people most likely to help a stranger. I wonder if we would have picked any of these countries.
Interesting.
They were people from Libya, Iraq, Kuwait, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Maybe we have more than we think. Again, no shame, no guilt, but maybe those myths, those assumptions, maybe there's another way. And James is really inviting us, I think, to consider this other way. Yeah. And what he does in doing so, though, is calls us to pay attention to the tension. I want to be generous, but I'm not sure I can. What can I do with that? Wow. I think that's what he's leading us into today.
Exactly. And he's addressing, and you mentioned it, something at the core of it, which can be fear. We can have this fear of taking this risk or leaning into generosity. One of my favorite books, Addiction and Grace by Dr. Gerald May, he talks about we have this God-given void in us to either love and be loved, and love or be loved. And if we don't fill that void with God's love, we'll either repress it and act like it's not there, or we'll attach it to something unhealthy. And he causes that word attachment addiction. Yes. And I've been there in my life where I know there is something, there's this part of me that longs to be loved, there's part of me that longs to love, but I attach it to something unhealthy. As far as a 4-for-4 meal at Wendy's. Anybody else? I know who you are. I see you in the drive-thru. We'll just honk and keep and wave and just keep going, right? We attach ourselves to things that are not healthy. And I think the same is true with generosity. I think there is something profound about generosity that's just a part of who we are as human beings. You can never be a part of church, never hear about God, but you watch that video and you hear Zach speak, and there is something inside of you that comes alive, and nobody had to coach it, nobody had to cultivate it. It's just part of who you are. When you see generosity in motion, there's a part of our humanity that comes alive. What do we do with that? Do we suppress it or act like it's not there or attach it to something unhealthy? And James says when we attach it to things that are unhealthy, that's when we get pride and arrogance, and that's when we make those assumptions. And it's our prayer today that God, given this part of us that longs to be generous, would come alive today and be activated. Because here's why. God created us in his image. And I don't think God would be as generous as he is and then create us without that same propensity to be generous. How do I know God is generous? John 3:16. For God so loved the world. He did what? He gave. His only begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have just a temporary life, a life that'll maybe last 60%. No, a life that's what? It's everlasting. God's generosity is everlasting. God's generosity connects us to eternity. And when we say yes to that, and when we receive that, that generosity begins to flow in every area of our lives. And generosity is not about money. That's a part of it. Generosity is about our heart. And when our hearts are in a posture that says, God, I realize you've blessed me so I can be a blessing to others, guess what that does? That puts our faith in motion. And Justin, James has some real key things to say to this church about that very thing.
Yeah, he does. So we're going to pick it up in James chapter 4, verses 13 and following. So let's read that together. So it starts like this. It says, look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town and will stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. So let me hit pause for a moment. That first line that we read, actually, I was looking at it, it kind of makes sense. I mean, there actually is something about making plans. There actually is something about doing good work. There is actually something that we would have an intent that the work we do would actually flourish and produce something good, right? I think we're all into that. The scriptures even back those things up. Those things in their own right are not wrong. They're not being pushed against here by James. It's actually the rest of this text that I think shows us what had gone on under the surface, though, that was kind of mutating and morphing those things that could be good and then making them something other. So let's keep going a little bit. Verse 14, how do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? So again, they're making these plans. There's all this stuff, but now he's getting to what was going on, what their attitudes and postures were like. How do you actually know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's there a little while, and then it's gone, unless you look out here today and you're like, it's still here. But I think we get that. And James actually earlier in this letter had already talked about it in James chapter 1. He was kind of talking to that same attitude of those who thought they were self-made and they were the producers of their own good and they didn't have that providential view. He had already spoken to them a little bit. Like in James 1:11, he says, hey, the hot sun rises, the grass withers, the little flower droops and falls, and its beauty fades away. In the same way, and he has this little term he uses for those who would approach life in this assumptive, presumptive, I'm self-made way and I'm not generous. He would call them the rich. And he says, the same way, they will fade away with all their achievements. And that's what he's posing here. How do we know what will happen tomorrow? Down in verse 15, he keeps going, instead of that approach, instead of that attitude, he says, what we should say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. So he's really getting to the heart of what was going on with those folks. And I think he calls me to ask some questions about my own life, how I plan, how I work, how I view my days. Are they a gift from God, or again, am I the autonomous person making it happen on its own? And there's something to examine in that, I think, in our hearts. And about this boasting, I think we all know the way of boasting, it's pretty lame, actually, right? When you've encountered someone who's just throwing it in your face. The beautiful thing, though, is the New Testament shares that in the Jesus way, there actually is a way to boast that is so good and that lines us up with this posture that'll open us up to generosity. For instance, think of Paul, who wrote a lot of the letters we have in the New Testament, had this great encounter with the original generous one, God himself in the form of Christ, right? He says, I actually don't boast about all those things, kind of like what these folks were. What I'm going to boast about is the cross of Christ.
Come on.
I'm going to boast about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. I'm going to boast about this whole new life I've been invited into that works a different way, that has a different economy, that's bigger than we ever thought, that is more generous and radically open. I'm going to boast about that. So instead of boasting about these small things that maybe we're tempted to, there's another way. And so then James comes out of that and says, so remember, it's a sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it. He's really getting at the heart of what you said we're looking at today, that the Jesus way in all of life, including generosity, it's trust. It's acting on what we know. It's not presumption. It's trust.
It's trust. And he goes again to take a deeper dive, Justin, at the heart of what was really fueling these people's need for accumulating more stuff. Let's pick it up in chapter 5, verse 1. I love how James is having a clear family talk. He says, look here, When my mom said that, I needed to stand by. Look here, you rich people, weep and groan with anguish because of all of the terrible troubles ahead of you. Your wealth is rotting away, and your fine clothes are moth-eaten rags. No matter where you buy them, Saks Fifth Avenue, Ross, TJ Maxx, they're even rotting away. Your gold and your silver have become worthless. The very wealth you were counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. This treasure you have accumulated will stand as evidence against you on the day of judgment. For listen, hear the cries of the field workers whom you have cheated of their pay. The wages you held back cry out against you. The cries of those who harvest your fields have reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies. You have spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying your every desire. You have fattened yourselves for the day of slaughter. You have condemned and killed innocent people who do not resist you. Justin James is actually getting at a pretty interesting tension that we need to lean into. It's not money itself that's bad or evil. I want to be in a position to where my family is provided for and I have things and I'm able to have a life. Jesus says the thief comes to steal, kill, and to destroy. But I have come that you may have life and have that life more abundantly or to the full. I want to be able to be blessed so I can be a blessing. It's not money itself that's evil. What is it? It's the love of money that's evil. That's the root of all evil, is this love of money. What does that mean? What will I do to accumulate more stuff? Will I lie? Will I cheat? Will I steal? Will I oppress the poor to make sure that I'm padded and successful in every way? Many of you know my story. I came up in corporate America for 13 years prior to coming into ministry. And in that environment, it was cutthroat. Do everything you can to reach it to the top, corporate ladder, and step on whoever you can, Justin, to get there. And then when you arrive at the top of the ladder, and you have the desk, and you have the cherry wood frame with your degree in it. You can put your feet up on the desk and have the person, your administrative assistant, book all of your appointments. You realize something is still missing. And I'm for that. I'm for being at the top and working hard. And I champion my daughters and my family to do that. But one thing that can't change is this heart that God gave us to be generous, that as I climb the corporate ladder, I'm pulling those along with me. I'm actually looking for my replacement so I can pass on the generosity that I have received. And James is saying you cannot call yourselves followers of Jesus and don't hear the cries of the people. And as a church, you're saying, Ken, what does generosity mean? It means this for me, that I'm hearing the cries of the people. I'm hearing the cries of those families in those hospitals trying to figure out the next step medically for their child. And not even Christmas is not even on their radar. They're trying to make sure that child gets the next breath. That's the cry I hear. I hear the cry of those in the community looking for a meal. I hear the cry of those that are looking for a hygiene pack, something that I take for granted. I've lost count of how many tubes of toothpaste I have on my counter. I hear the cries of somebody now that it's wet outside, looking for a tarp so they can put it over their tent or get some extra socks so they can stay warm. That's what generosity means to me. Are we hearing the cries of those that are hurting, those that are broken? It's time to get the generosity in motion. James is saying you don't accumulate this stuff so you can sit on it and point to those that are hurting. No, you open up that can and you give. That's why he said you take care of the orphans and you take care of the widows. That's what true religion looks like. And so we have to ask ourselves today, what does this generosity look like in motion, Justin? A few things we wrote down in our time left.
Yeah, when we put our generosity in motion, there are several great things that happen. One we noted is that unexpected joy is the product. So I was thinking about this, and several things came to mind. You won't have to look very far, but in the field of neuroscience, there are study upon study upon study that have been done that show people who have an open-handed approach, a generous approach, who actually are engaging in acts of generosity, they're actually more happy than other people. Like, it's quite interesting how our whole design has been kind of set forth by God, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's because we follow God's lead in that. I was thinking about that this last week. So on Tuesday, my 15-year-old son, Noah, his soccer team made it to the divisional round of their playoffs, which is pretty cool.
Come on.
And so I was looking a bit at the schedule. They were headed out to Friday Harbor, which is a little far from where I live. So I decided I should probably take the day off work and go kind of watch that and spend the day with them. It was a blast. So I'm driving. We take this early ferry from Port Townsend. You get on the other side, And I got to tell you, the sun was coming up, and it was absolutely stunning, the view. I don't know if you've just had those moments where the natural world, it's that Gerard Manley Hopkins poem, right? The world is full of the grandeur of God. It was just like blowing me up. And it was this moment, I'm not even an overly emotional person, but I'm driving, and I'm actually kind of glad my son was in a car with some other people at the moment, because I'm just driving, and I'm like tearing up, and I'm like, this is amazing. And I was just astounded, and I was just talking to God, like, look what you've done.
Yeah, come on.
Look at the world you've put us in that is beautiful. Look at the world you've put us in that sustains us.
Yeah.
Look at the world that you have gifted. Look at this place I get to live.
Come on.
And then it led me to thinking, oh my goodness, how else have you been generous to me? And then it struck me, I'm on my way to watch my 15-year-old son. I have 4 kids that God has blessed me with, graced me with. Mm-hmm. And this 15-year-old that I was going to see, he's strong and growing, and I'm getting to watch him grow up and become himself. How cool is that?
Yeah.
I also have a job where I can actually take a vacation day and go do that.
Yeah.
Like, how has the Lord blessed me over and over and over and over again?
Yeah,
I mean, right now, we're sitting here breathing in air we didn't make. We're being sustained by organs within our being that are just marvelous in their function that we aren't even thinking of.
Yeah.
We have been blessed. We have been generously blessed, and it evokes joy, right, when we encounter those things. And so then when we get to like kind of follow God's lead into that, it's a no-brainer that it actually produces unexpected joy both in us and in the world.
Come on.
Like, how many of you can remember stories of giving gifts to other, and it is some of the best memories of your life, right?
Yeah.
Like, I was thinking through that, gifts I've gotten to give my family, but also gifts I've gotten to give my friends, and even people that I haven't known very long. Those are literally some of my best memories. To watch a person's whole body change, their shoulders change, their face change, their outlook on life change, because joy is now part of the equation. It is so beautiful, and we get to participate in that. And I actually think this generous posture that produces unexpected joy, again, it does it for everyone, us and them. I think that's what Jesus was kind of trying to point us to. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, hey, why don't you take a minute, look at the birds, look at the lilies, look at this world I've made. Is it worried that it's not going to get what it needs?
Come on.
No, because you have a loving Father that cares for you. And what he says in that text is, don't worry. What we get to do when we put our generosity in motion is we get to trade our worry for joy. And we get to be agents of joy in the world as we watch people experience God's goodness. It's something to celebrate.
It really is. And as we celebrate that, one of the things we get to add to the list is rich relationships.
Yeah.
Write that down. When our generosity is in motion, we have rich relationships. Got a text message today that yesterday somebody lost their mother. And it's like, man, coming alongside families in times of grief is something we're called to as a church. And then I begin to reflect on my own life. And as I come to the end of my life here on earth as I know it, I don't think I'll be on my deathbed looking at my family in the eye saying, man, I wish I would have spent more money. I think I'm going to be looking at them saying, man, I wish I would have invested, or perhaps I'm so glad I invested in these rich relationships. This generosity that God has kind of intrinsically wired us with is for us to also invest in relationships. And here's what I'm learning, friends, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Father time and mother time, they are undefeated. Time does not wait. My oldest daughter is getting ready to graduate from high school. I remember bringing her to church in a car seat. My youngest daughter, she's a freshman in high school. My middle daughter's a sophomore. So I'm thinking about college. And now my middle daughter is like, when am I going to get a car? I'm like, you need a car too? Good God, what's happening? All these things, all of these changes that happen to us. I look in the mirror, and there was a time I used to have a hairline. That hairline has disappeared. I look at Justin, I'm like, you're a little older than me. He has all that on the top. What's going on, God? How can I have joy, right? And so in this season of our life, as God is generous to us, it's for us to also be generous in our hospitality. And some of the lifelong relationships that I have in my life now were only because we made a commitment to invest in community, invest in a small group. One of my best friends, I'll call his name, Jeff Seacrest. That's my man. We met in a small group. What relationships is God going to cultivate in your life as you open the door for generosity, which is tied to hospitality, which then breeds those rich relationships? What's the next thing we got, Justin?
Yeah, when we put our generosity in motion, we also see this posture kind of being formed in us, a posture of willing sacrifice.
Yeah.
And James has already actually talked to the church that we're looking in on, and he's spoken to them about this already. If you go back into chapter 2, he kind of paints this picture, and he says, hey, if you see someone like come in and they're not doing so well, they need food, they need help, they need clothes, you're not going to come back to them and say, oh, I hope everything goes well for you. See you later. Peace out. Like, you know that the right thing to do, the actual logical thing to do is people who've been given through the generosity of God, the right, really clear thing to do is to show generosity, right? To meet that need.
Absolutely.
And he actually even says a failure to do so would kind of reveal that the pedals of the bike we're riding in this series, faith and works, they're not working in tandem. Instead, there's this willing sacrifice that kind of begins to form how we live in the world. And I was thinking about that. And when Hannah and I were just about to get married, I had finished up a semester at college, and I had driven from Missouri, where I was going to school, to Eastern Washington, to the Tri-Cities, and I worked for a roofer that summer. And his name was John, pretty simple-looking guy. House wasn't much to look at. The shop of the roofing company was right next to the house. You actually had to drive through kind of like almost like a farm gate like I'd seen growing up in Tennessee to get in. It was very simple. Old pickup truck, simple old clothes, not much in the way of being spectacular. Really kind, really good businessman, good to his people. But, you know, you're like, man, you've been at this a while. You've been running this company for a while. This looks pretty meager, pretty simple. What I found out that I didn't know, he didn't know that I found this out, by the way, but that he and his wife, several years before that, they had had this encounter with the generous God. They had experienced this full life that Jesus invited them into. And so they started getting creative and saying, what if we actually lived on 10% of our income and gave away 90%? And so he didn't care what his truck looked like. He didn't care what his clothes looked like. He didn't care what his house looked like. It was fine. It took care of them. They provided care and hospitality like you're talking about to others. But he really embodied this willing sacrifice. And again, he didn't know that I knew that. You would have never picked up that vibe from him. He wasn't trying to showboat or like put it out there. But it was just who he was because God had been so good to him. How could he not? He was following Jesus's way. 1 John 3:16-18 says, Jesus gave his life for us, and he calls to give our lives for our brothers and sisters. And my friend John was embodying that, and we get to embody that when we realize how much we've been given.
Oh, come on. And as we embody that, the last thing you can write down is this: you have a lasting impact. Lasting impact. I'm going to ask the band to come, and we're going to have a word of prayer here, and we'll be done. But the lasting impact, one of the things that we do as a church, and we'll do it in 2020, we select words of the year. And these are words that you can select to kind of orient your life around some you're praying for, maybe being challenged, or something to keep you encouraged. And my word of the year for 2019 was the word impact. Impact. How am I making a difference? And what I learned about that word as I studied it, and it's so profound, it's not if I'm going to make an impact. The question is, what kind of impact am I going to make, right? And so is my impact going to be an impact that people can look at and point to Jesus and say, wow, this is a man who was sold out for the gospel, loved God, loved his family, loved people. That's the impact that generosity allows us to make. And the good news is that impact is lasting. It's eternal. And here's why I get so emotional thinking about that lasting impact. As I think about my own life and my own story, Justin, I do not deserve to be standing here in front of you this morning. Based on my story, based on my sin, based on my history, based on my past, based on my resume, I have every reason to be disqualified to stand here and share the good news alongside a good friend in front of all you wonderful people. But that's the good news about God's generosity. In spite of my sin, in spite of my resume, in spite of my past, in spite of all my issues, by the way, you have issues too. We all have issues, right? In spite of all that, God says, I can use you. I choose you. Everything that you've been exposed to, everything that you've done, every place that you think has been wrong, every thought, every deed, God says, I know all of that, and I'm still so generous that I pick you. Do you receive that today? To know that there is a plan for your life, that the generosity of God is not for us to just sit and hoard and hold on to. No, it's for us to open up our hearts and our minds and our hands to those around us so they can receive that generosity too. And the reason I'm up here, not only yes, God's grace and his mercy, but it was those people using their generosity to invest in me. To say, you're not a failure. You can make it. God can use you. He does have a plan for your life. And God's gonna send people our way. And as he sends them our way, we're gonna have to ask ourselves, is this a moment where I allow myself to be as generous as God has been generous to me? And with that question, what's our action step?
Yeah.
As we close.
With what we've heard today, I think it's quite logical. It makes sense that our action today would, let's actually be a people who are generous together. You with me?
Yeah.
Let's be generous. The way the scriptures say it is, consider the ways that you can stir each other up to love and good deeds.
Come on.
I think that's what we get to do. And again, we've kind of alluded to it. We've seen that already when we look back at our story together. Expressions of that. In the coming days, we're going to have collective opportunities to do that. How many of you think we can actually help Zach meet his need to have more than 5,000 toys for kids who are in local hospitals? I think we can do that. I think we can collectively participate in that generous way.
Yeah.
I think through the Christmas season, we're going to have opportunities to create space of belonging and welcome and all kinds of good for people in this neighborhood. So let's do that together. But I think it goes even beyond that. I think it goes maybe to an even more granular level. Throughout this month of November, we're asking the question, who are you gonna spend time around the table with? We have this fun little word for calling those Friendsgivings.
Yeah.
Some of our groups have already been doing it, but I would ask that question, who in the coming days would you open up room at your table for? I know Roz and I, to make room for maybe some of you who are newer and you're not sure kind of who to connect with yet, on the 19th, we're gonna host just a wide open Friendsgiving at Crane's Castle. Come on down and spend time around the table. But who can you do that for as well? I don't know what your response is today in that, but let's be a people who are generous together. And we want to give you a few minutes to consider how you might respond to God in that. And so I'd encourage you, grab the Connect card. It's in your program, or you can also find it on our app. And it has some very specific responses you might be compelled to lean into today. I mean, we've talked over and over about all of this generosity talk, all of this posture of generosity. It's a response because we both have encountered a generous God and how he's loved us through generous people. And we've met that God in the person of Jesus Christ. And maybe your response today is, I hear this talk about generosity. Maybe it's actually time for me to say yes to following the generous one, Jesus. Maybe you've kind of been on the edge of that and you're like, I really want to follow and I want to declare I'm in and I want to be baptized. Check that on your card. Ken, you talked about, and we just talked about making room at the table. Maybe it's doing life together and it's time for you to either create a group or join a group with others. You can check that on the card. I don't know what you'll check, but we're going to take a few moments and we're going to respond. Maybe for you, you need to share a prayer request that this church can pray with you about as you're walking into these days. So what's going to happen is the band's going to play for a few minutes. Take time and ask the question, Jesus, how do you want me to respond today? I know you're full of grace and generosity, so I know it'll be good as I lean in. And let's do that together, and then in a few minutes, we're going to worship together, buckets will pass, and we'll be sent on to the mission. But let's take just a moment to respond.